At 6 o'clock on the evening of June 30th, 2005, 19-year-old Jenny Nicholl walked out of her family home in Richmond, North Yorkshire, kissed her mother goodbye, and said she would not be back that night. Her mother watched her go, believing she would see her again in the morning, but she never returned. 4 days later, her white Rover 214i was discovered sitting quietly in the car park of a local pub, locked and abandoned.
She left home telling her parents she'd be spending the night with friends. They assume she left in her white P-Reg Rover 214i. She hasn't been seen since.
Nothing to suggest why she would disappear. She just didn't.
Then, 9 days after Jenny had last been seen, her mobile phone came back to life. Messages were sent. They came from near the Scottish border, from places far enough away to suggest distance, independence, maybe even escape. One message read, "I'm living in Scotland with my boyfriend." Another said, "I'm not coming back." And then there was the line that cut through everything. "The police won't find me." For a brief, fragile moment, her parents allowed themselves to believe that she was alive, that this was rebellion rather than tragedy, that their daughter had chosen to disappear. But the words were wrong. Someone had tried to sound like Jenny. Someone had tried to create the illusion of a girl still breathing somewhere in Scotland. Those messages were meant to buy time. They were meant to convince the world that Jenny Nicholl had simply walked away. But the man behind the messages, the murderer and master planner, was someone no one saw coming. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Richmond, North Yorkshire, was the kind of place where people recognized each other in the high street and remembered what you ordered at the pub, and nothing about it suggested the sort of story that would one day draw national attention. Jenny Nicholl had grown up in that calm rhythm. She was 19, worked at the local co-op stacking shelves and chatting with customers she had known for years, and spent her evenings playing guitar in pub bands where regulars would nod along because they had watched her grow from a teenager into a confident young woman with a stage presence that surprised people. She loved music, especially the older rock her parents had played at home, and she loved camping because it gave her space and independence, and she had a habit of disappearing into the countryside with friends for a night, and coming back the next day with stories that were half-told and slightly guarded. She was social, but she was also private. Friends later said she did not always confide in them, and even her parents admitted there were parts of her life they did not fully see, which at 19 did not feel unusual. She lived with her parents, Anne and Brian Nicholl, on Bolton Avenue in a house that had been their base for years. On June 30th, 2005, she told her mother she was staying with friends. She carried what looked like camping gear, which did not alarm anyone because she had done it before, and she left at around 6 in the evening with the casual certainty of someone who expected to return. The next day, Jenny was supposed to pick up a friend for a night out, and when she did not arrive, it felt inconvenient at first, then slightly odd, and then worrying. So calls were made and messages were sent, but there was no reply. However, it was still possible that she had stayed somewhere overnight and forgotten to check in, so her family waited, and then they waited some more. And as the hours stretched into days, it became obvious that something had gone terribly wrong. By July 4th, Anne reported her daughter missing because there had been no contact at all, and that same day she went out searching herself, moving through familiar streets with a growing sense of dread. It was Anne who found the white Rover 214i sitting quietly in the car park of the Holly Hill Inn pub, and the sight of it changed everything. The car was locked, there was no broken glass, and there were no obvious signs of a struggle, and nothing inside the vehicle told a clear story. It looked as though it had simply been parked there and left, and that was the first real crack in the narrative. Because if Jenny had left voluntarily, she would not have abandoned her car without a word, and if something had happened to her suddenly, there would likely have been signs of disruption. So, an incident room was established at Richmond Police Station, and 20 officers were assigned to the case. Officers went door to door, speaking to neighbors who had known Jenny for years, and they visited the pubs where she played guitar and where she was recognized by name, asking the same questions over and over in the hope that someone had seen her, spoken to her, or noticed something that had not seemed important at the time. Jenny was not a stranger in Richmond, and that was what made the absence so unsettling, because in a town like that, someone always saw something. So detectives began piecing together her last known movements, and as they did, one location surfaced again and again in quiet conversations. Sandbeck Plantation. Sandbeck Plantation was not just another patch of countryside, it was a dense woodland area on the edge of town, crisscrossed with narrow paths and thick undergrowth, and it was known to a small circle of locals who used it as a place to gather, drink, camp, and escape the routine of daily life. Among those locals were David Hodgson and his brother, Robert, who had built rough wooden huts there over the years, simple shelters tucked into the trees, hidden enough to feel private but familiar enough to return to. Jenny's parents went there themselves, not because police asked them to, but because waiting at home had become unbearable. They walked through the woodland calling her name, pushing through damp undergrowth, scanning the ground for anything that did not belong. And it was there, beneath leaves darkened by rain and pressed into the soil, that they found items that stopped them cold. There were cosmetics, there was a nightdress. They were not laid out in plain sight, but partially concealed, as though someone had taken care to push them out of view. Police were called immediately, and the area was sealed. What had been woodland now became a potential scene of significance, and officers began systematic searches that stretched far beyond the initial discovery. More than 150 acres were combed through methodically, and soldiers from nearby Catterick Garrison were brought in to assist, moving in lines across the terrain and checking every clearing, every ditch, every hidden corner that might hold an answer. They searched caves, they checked marshland, they examined disused mine shafts, and they returned again and again to the huts that David and Robert had built, looking for anything that tied Jenny to that place in a way that could not be explained away. However, for all the manpower and all the hours poured into the operation, there was no trace of her. There was no confirmed site where something had happened, no discovery that explained how she had vanished, and no clear sign that told investigators whether she had been harmed there or whether something had occurred elsewhere entirely. And so the plantation became both a focal point and a frustration, because it was the first location that felt close to Jenny's final movements, and yet it offered no resolution. As officers retraced Jenny's movements and mapped out the people in her life, a name surfaced that shifted the direction of the investigation, and it did not come from a stranger or a brief acquaintance, but from someone who had known her for years. Police discovered that Jenny had been seeing an older man, and when they identified him, the age difference alone raised questions that could not be ignored. His name is David Hodgson. He was 45 years old, married, and the father of 2 daughters who had attended the same school as Jenny. He was not an outsider drifting through town. He was local, familiar, and woven into the same small community that had watched Jenny grow up. And that familiarity made the situation more complicated. Investigators learned that David had known Jenny since she was 14, and as they began to speak to people in her circle, the word that kept surfacing was grooming. The relationship had not begun openly or publicly. It had developed gradually, quietly, and in a way that blurred boundaries over time. When officers first approached David, he denied having any kind of sexual relationship with Jenny, presenting himself as nothing more than someone who knew her casually through family connections. However, under further questioning, he later admitted that he and Jenny had slept together 5 times, but he insisted that this had only happened after she turned 16, as though the timeline itself could neutralize the imbalance. Police did not accept that explanation at face value. The age gap was significant, the secrecy surrounding the relationship was troubling, and the fact that Jenny's parents had been unaware of the extent of it added another layer of concern. Officers were now looking at a situation where a 19-year-old who had vanished without warning had been involved with a man more than twice her age. But David also denied taking Jenny to the huts in Sandbeck Plantation. He said she had not been there before. He maintained that whatever relationship they had shared did not involve those makeshift shelters hidden in the trees. But when police sealed off the woodland close to his huts and began a systematic search, they found items that belonged unmistakably to Jenny, her teddy bear, and a portable stereo. Then 9 days after Jenny was last seen, David was brought in for questioning. He was asked about his relationship with her, about the nature of their contact, and about his movements on the night she disappeared. He denied harming her. He denied knowing where she was. He denied having any involvement in her disappearance beyond what he had already admitted about their past intimacy. Then, something happened that changed the tone of the case entirely. The very next day, Jenny's mobile phone switched back on. After days of silence, it suddenly transmitted life, and messages began to circulate. Messages that seemed to confirm that she was alive, that she had chosen to leave, and that everyone had been worrying unnecessarily. On paper, it looked like relief. But for detectives who had just finished questioning David Hodgson, the timing felt too precise to ignore. The first one went to her friend Jennifer. It read, "Hi Jen, tell Jake I am okay, no everyone's gonna be mad, tell them I am sorry. Living in Scotland with my boyfriend. Shitting meself, dad's gonna kill me, mum don't give a shit. Hope Nick didn't grass me up. Keeping phone of. Tell dad car jumps out of gear and stalls put it back in auction. Tell him I am sorry." Then another message followed, this time to Nicola, another friend. "Thoughta were grassing me up. Might be in trub with me. Dad told mum I was living, didn't give a shit. Been to Keswick camping was great. Ave to go Saya." And then came the message that landed hardest, sent directly to her father, and it did not soften its tone. "Why do you hate me? I know mum does. Told her I was going. I ain't coming back and the pigs won't find me. I am happy living up here. Everyone hates me and rich only maid I got is Jack. TX'd you couple weeks tell pigs I am nearly 20 ain't cumin back. They can shite off. She got me in this shit. It's her fault, not mine. Get blamed for everything. I am sorry. Okay, just had to leave. She's a bitch. No food in and always searching me room, eating me sweets. Have to go. Okay, I am very sorry. X." For a moment, those words did what they were meant to do. They created distance, and they created an explanation, and they allowed Anne to believe that her daughter was alive somewhere beyond the Scottish border, perhaps angry, perhaps reckless, but choosing to stay away. So Anne traveled to Carlisle because the phone data pointed there, and she searched, and then she traveled to Jedburgh when another signal placed the device near the border again. But Jenny was not in either place, and the hope that had come back to life began to thin. However, investigators were not reading the messages emotionally, they were reading them analytically, and when they laid them beside Jenny's previous texts, small fractures began to appear. She did not usually write "I am" in full, she wrote "I'm," and that contraction was consistent across her genuine messages. She had her own shorthand habits, and she often spelled certain words her own way, and yet here the spelling shifted, the rhythm changed, and even the spacing around numbers looked different. The grammar felt inconsistent, and the tone swung between apology and accusation in a way that did not sit comfortably with the way she normally spoke to friends. Individually, each difference seemed trivial, but together they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed. The messages sounded like Jenny, but they did not think like Jenny. Someone had tried to reproduce her voice, and although the attempt was detailed, it was not precise, and those small imperfections were enough to turn reassurance into suspicion. Someone was mimicking her, and the more detectives studied those lines, the clearer it became that the person behind them knew her well enough to imitate her, but not well enough to disappear inside her words. However, during the investigation, detectives examined every digital device inside the Nicholl home, because when a young woman disappears, police do not assume anything. They test everything. They seized computers, reviewed internet histories, and looked for communications that might suggest conflict, coercion, or preparation to leave. And during that examination, something unrelated to Jenny's disappearance surfaced. Indecent images involving children were found on Brian Nicholl's laptop. It was a serious discovery, and it was treated as such. He was later charged in connection with those images and admitted offenses relating to possession. The matter was dealt with in court, and he received a community-based sentence. It was damaging, humiliating, and deeply painful for the family, particularly given the timing. However, investigators were clear about one crucial point. There was no evidence linking those offenses to Jenny's disappearance or death.
Let's see if we can get a result now in a case that is fraught with emotion, that of 19-year-old Jenny Nicholl. For 6 months now, her mum and dad in Yorkshire have been frantic to know what's become of her. And you must have been frantic when she just disappeared.
Well, I was. Nothing to suggest why she would disappear. She just didn't come home one night, and I didn't find her car until the Monday in the car park, as you just said.
She hadn't taken any money out of the bank, or she hadn't
Nope.
taken a passport or made any preparation?
Still there, money's still in the bank. There was no preparation for leaving home at all. She just didn't come back one evening.
Is that her teddy bear?
This is the teddy that her dad bought her on Christmas, and that went from the home maybe 2 2.5 months before she left.
So this is a replica, is it?
This is a replica, yeah.
With a little khaki suit on.
Absolutely,
so if
yeah.
anybody's seen that, we want to know about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
D.I. Pete Martin, why have you come to Crimewatch on this now?
We've received some new information which now suggests the answer to this investigation is very, very local.
Very, very local to Richmond in Yorkshire.
To Richmond itself in Yorkshire, yes.
And yet there were text messages sent on Jenny's phone from Jedburgh and from Carlisle.
Yes, there were, and I believe those text messages were sent by somebody who was very close to Jenny, perhaps even a boyfriend, with the intention of creating a belief that Jenny's still alive, which I don't believe to be the case.
You think she was murdered?
Yes, I do.
So either the killer or perhaps an accomplice deliberately tried to set a false trail?
That's right, yes.
Do you know the whole network of Jenny's friends? I mean, I don't know if you know all the friends she had. Very few people do of teenage daughters. Did you know everybody who knew her?
No, Jenny is quite a deep person and kept a lot to herself. So no, I don't know who her was.
You know some. Presumably you now need to get a complete matrix of everybody.
We do, yes. We're keen to trace all Jenny's friends, and in particular to find out anybody amongst that circle of friends who visited the Carlisle and Jedburgh areas on the dates those messages were sent.
So far from this being a complete open mystery with nothing to go on, you've actually got quite a lot of pieces of this jigsaw puzzle already. Is that right?
We're just seeking the final piece now.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, well, if you can provide that final piece, if you have any information, call us here in the studio or call the incident room 01609 768 111.
Detectives then explored the possibility of her actually running away from home, because when a young adult disappears, police examine the family environment thoroughly before focusing elsewhere. They looked into Jenny's home life, they reviewed family interactions, they spoke to friends, they examined whether there was any documented history of violence, complaints, or prior reports that would support the idea that she was fleeing danger. They found none. There was no evidence that Jenny had packed belongings to start over. There was no bank activity suggesting preparation. She had prepaid for 10 tanning sessions and used only 2, which suggested she had expected to remain in town. Her passport had not been used, there were no travel bookings, no job applications elsewhere, no hidden savings account, and crucially, there was no independent evidence supporting the claim that she had been or driven out. And so detectives turned to someone who specialized in the one thing the killer had underestimated: language. Professor Malcolm Coulthard, a forensic linguist with experience analyzing disputed communications, was brought in to examine the texts and to measure patterns that most people never consciously notice. He was given 11 genuine messages that Jenny had sent before she disappeared, more than 100 messages written by David Hodgson, and the 3 key texts sent after Jenny had supposedly begun her new life in Scotland. He laid them side by side, looking at the structure, spelling, punctuation, rhythm, and habit, because writing, especially informal texting, carries fingerprints that are difficult to suppress. People repeat the same shortcuts, the same misspellings, the same grammatical shortcuts, and they do so instinctively. As he worked through the material, patterns began to emerge. David consistently spelled might as might, and that was not a common error, but a habitual one. He regularly dropped apostrophes where they would normally appear, and he misspelled simple words such as off, sometimes shortening them or altering them in a way that became characteristic. Those features, when isolated, might have meant nothing. However, when the disputed messages were examined, the same quirks surfaced. The same dropped apostrophes appeared. The same unconventional spelling of might showed up. The same structural habits crept into sentences that were meant to sound like Jenny. Coulthard was careful in his conclusions, and he did not overreach. He said he could not state definitively that David Hodgson had written the messages because linguistic analysis does not operate in absolutes, but he explained that David shared a significant number of the same distinctive features found in the texts, and that this placed him within a very small group of possible authors. Meanwhile, investigators were not relying on language alone. They examined David's movements during the days the messages were sent, and that inquiry led to another discovery that narrowed the field even further. Car rental records showed that David had hired vehicles on July 9th and again on July 14th, which were the exact days the texts had been transmitted. The recorded mileage on those cars matched the approximate round-trip distances from Richmond to Carlisle and from Richmond to Jedburgh, the very areas where the phone signals had originated. So the narrative that had once suggested a rebellious teenager starting over in Scotland began to fall under the weight of detail. By January 17, 2006, the investigation had moved from suspicion to action, and officers arrested both David Hodgson and his older brother Robert in connection with Jenny's disappearance. However, Robert was later released without charge, and although that development removed one name from the immediate frame, it did not weaken the focus on David. He was released on bail pending further inquiries, but the scrutiny did not ease, and the case continued to build quietly. Months passed as investigators refined the evidence, and in May 2007, David Hodgson was formally charged with Jenny Nicholl's murder. It was a significant step, not least because there was still no body, no confirmed crime scene, and no physical discovery that could anchor the charge in the traditional way juries often expect. The prosecution, however, believed the evidence was sufficient, and when the case came before Teesside Crown Court in January 2008, the trial began in earnest. It lasted 5 weeks, and during that time, the court heard not only about Jenny's disappearance, but about the nature of her relationship with David, the timing of the text messages, the linguistic analysis, and the car hire records that placed him traveling to the very areas from which those messages had been sent. The defense attempted to redirect the narrative, arguing that Jenny had run away and that tension at home had pushed her to leave voluntarily. They suggested she had wanted a new life, and they implied that her father had been abusive, framing her disappearance as a personal decision rather than a crime. However, that claim did not withstand scrutiny. Mr. Justice Openshaw later stated there was not the slightest shred of supporting evidence to back the suggestion of, and the court heard nothing concrete that substantiated the idea that Jenny had planned to abandon her life. Meanwhile, the prosecution laid out a different theory, one grounded not in speculation but in motive and sequence. They argued that David had been jealous, that Jenny had grown closer to his older brother Robert, and that this shift in attention had unsettled him deeply. They described him as possessive, unable to accept that the relationship had changed, and they contended that on the night Jenny disappeared, he killed her and then disposed of her body somewhere in the surrounding countryside, choosing a location that would be difficult to search and even harder to prove. After the evidence was heard and the arguments concluded, the jury retired to deliberate. They were out for 10 hours, weighing a case built without a body, but anchored in patterns, timing, and behavior. In February 2008, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. David Hodgson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years before he could be considered for parole. In delivering the sentence, Mr. Justice Openshaw said that the evidence against him was entirely overwhelming, and he observed that there had been no remorse shown throughout the proceedings. He further noted that by concealing Jenny's body and refusing to reveal its location, David had prolonged the suffering of her family, extending their grief beyond the courtroom and into every year that followed. The conviction brought legal closure, but it did not bring Jenny home, and that absence would continue to define everything that came after. But David Hodgson never admitted guilt, and he never revealed where Jenny's body was, and that silence became its own form of punishment for her family. However, despite the anguish, Anne and Brian made a decision that surprised many people. They refused to ask David where Jenny was. They would not beg him, and they would not grant him the power of being the only person who could relieve their suffering. If he chose to speak, that would be his decision, but they would not give him control over their grief. Years passed, and the broader justice system began to confront cases like Jenny's more directly. Campaigns led by other families, particularly the family of Helen McCourt, pushed for reform so that offenders who refused to disclose the location of their victims' remains could not benefit from that silence during parole reviews. The result was legislation widely known as Helen's Law, which required the parole board to take into account an offender's failure to reveal information about a victim's body when considering release. By the time the law came into effect, it carried Jenny's story within it, because her case had become one of the examples cited in discussions about concealment and prolonged suffering. When David Hodgson became eligible to seek parole, his continued refusal to admit guilt or disclose Jenny's whereabouts weighed heavily against him, and his attempts at early release failed. He remained in prison, and the legal system acknowledged that silence in this context was not neutral, but consequential. Yet despite those legal developments, one truth did not change. Jenny remained missing. Jenny's body has never been recovered, and her family still has no grave to visit. Somewhere in the North Yorkshire countryside, beneath soil that has shifted with seasons and years, there is still a secret buried, and it is a secret that one man continues to keep. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.